This is the season of Epiphany. We start the season by remembering 3 magi who followed the light. And the light brought them to a feed box. Well, that's the same thing as a manger. Aren't you glad the Bible translates it manger? Away in a feed box, no crib for a bed. Wouldn't it be a terrible way to celebrate Christmas? They used the French word rather than the other words, a manger. The light led them to a manger. And in that manger, they saw the light of the world. And then there was this baptism, Jesus in the Jordan, and light came into his life, and the heavens broke open, and this is my beloved Son. And then Jesus goes to the first of those disciples that he calls, Philip and Nathanael. And Nathanael, when he's called to be a disciple, looks at Jesus and says, You are the King of Israel. You are the Son of God. The light came into his heart and mind, and he saw. And Jesus says back to Nathanael, You will see greater things. You will see greater things. You will see. Heaven opened up. And you will see angels ascending and descending on the Son of Man. All of this light, this epiphany, this seeing how God has come into the world and it's spreading and it's entering human life and the world is changing and the darkness is giving way to this new light that has come into the world. And so it is on this kind of Sunday, an Epiphany Sunday, that we have the story of Jesus going to a wedding in Cana of Galilee. And they see something that's marvelous. The light, the Epiphany. It's an Epiphany story. Now the story says that Jesus and the disciples were at a wedding in Cana in Galilee. The reason I think the writer added in Galilee is because Cana is kind of a nowhere place. I mean, you put it in Galilee, so you get at least an idea of where it is. It's a nowhere place, you know. Nobody's ever heard of it. Sort of reminds me when folks are in conversation with me these days, they say, well, Tom, I understand you're preaching, helping a church somewhere. And I said, yes. Where are you? What church is it? And I say, well, it's Economy. Blank. Where? Oh, Economy. No. If they say they know where it is, I know they're lying. So I say, oh, it's a little bit east of Ambridge. Oh, yeah, I know where it is. Economy and Cana. Don't you think they have a little bit in common? I mean, a nowhere place. You have to have a map and a GPS to find this church. So Jesus and the disciples, a few miles north of where Jesus grew up, I think, is where Cana probably was. They don't know now. Nathanael's hometown. And they're at a wedding, and a wedding in a small village was the biggest thing that could ever happen. Nothing could be greater than a wedding in a rural village like Cana in Galilee. You know, people didn't eat very well. I mean, they were poor, and, you know, they didn't have meat every day. They didn't have wine except at parties. They just sort of had soupy gruel and what they could get by with. These were hard scrabble people. Hard scrabble people. Just barely had enough to eat. So when a wedding happens, I mean, this is an all-week thing. This goes on for several days. And there's meat. And there's wine. Wine, lots and lots of wine. It's a great thing. And in that culture and in that time, the worst possible thing that could ever happen was that the family would run out of wine. Not an embarrassment. No, not an embarrassment. A disgrace. This family would be disgraced forever. People would talk. Did you know they ran out of wine? They would never forget it. It was an unforgettable and unforgivable thing for a wedding to run out of wine. And this is exactly what happened. Jesus' mother, we don't know what her role was in this wedding, but she was aware that there was a crisis. And she comes to Jesus, who's there with his friends, just beginning his public ministry, and she makes the statement, they are out of wine. Now, what Jesus says next is somewhat of a puzzlement. Different scholars and interpreters of the Bible have different ways of understanding what Jesus says at this moment. For what Jesus says, and it depends on the translation that you use, one of the translations says, "What does that have to do with me?" Which almost sounds like, to some people's ears, it sounds like a rebuke. But having looked at all the possible things that Jesus could have meant, I don't think it was. He was speaking in an idiom. I remember one time when I was on sabbatical, I was in England, and I was around a bunch of young English men and women one afternoon, and we got talking about a movie I had seen, they had not seen. It was an American movie. And I made a statement. I said, "It's not too shabby." I had no idea what I was talking about. They thought I meant it's shabby, but not really bad shabby. You know, it's not too shabby. And then one of the English students realized the idiom, and he said, "Oh, I think I know what he means." And he explained to the others that when an American says that's not too shabby, we mean that's really great. That's wonderful. It's not too shabby. It's fantastic. And so Jesus says, I think it was an idiom. What does that have to do with me? Which I believe he meant just the opposite. This has everything to do with me. Because we're all connected here. Because we wouldn't want this young couple to start their wedding, their marriage, on a disgraceful moment. We wouldn't want this family to be the subject of scorn and ridicule for the rest of their lives. This has everything to do with me and with you and all of us. Because we're all connected. We're all connected. 60 Minutes several months ago, I don't watch it, but my wife makes me. She says, "You're going to learn something here. Sit down and watch this for an hour." And usually I'm glad I do. Several months ago, they ran a story about a young North Korean man, his name is Shin, who is the only one that we know about who has escaped from the prison labor camps that are in North Korea. I later on picked up book. I think I remember picking up his book and then reading Escape from Camp 14. You talk about hell on earth. This is the most unbelievable, hellish place on earth that you could ever imagine. And this young man was born into that camp. His parents had done something that they liked, and they allowed them to have a child. But he saw very little of his father, maybe just a glance every once in a while. His mother was not present to give him love at all. And can you imagine growing up from infancy into adulthood, and every day of your life you see people beaten and tortured and killed? And every day of your life is a struggle for existence. You have practically nothing to eat except if you can get a rat or a frog or something, an insect, and put it with your food. All you think about every day is eating, and they work you morning till night. It is the closest thing to being in hell that you can possibly imagine. And one evening, as Shin is going to sleep, he hears his brother and his mother plan an escape. And the first thing he does the next day is to report his mother and his brother. And in a few days, he watches them being executed. And he feels nothing. There's no remorse. There's no guilt. He has never experienced what it means to love. He is more animal than he is human. He talks about his experience after he escapes into China and then finally to the United States. A book is written, and now we know his story. And when he first told his story, he lied. He didn't tell about his mother and his brother until he realized later on that if he was ever going to be a human being, he would need to be honest. And he talks about his evolving from animal into human, and he's not there yet. It may take him the rest of his life. He was never loved. He's going to be trying for the rest of his life to learn to love, to be a human being. Jesus says, what does that have to do with me? It has everything to do with me and with you. We are all connected. Do you realize that you could not love God today? You cannot love God today. You cannot love your neighbor unless somebody somewhere has loved you. Maybe not your parents, but maybe a teacher or a friend or a grandmother or a neighbor. Somewhere in your life, someone has loved you and made it possible for you then to love others, love God, love neighbor. We are all connected together. Paul Brooks, who writes in the New York Times regularly, and I usually read what he has to say, has been doing a lot of articles in the last several months about what's the matter with us, with America. He says in his latest article, we should be riding the crest of success. The 20th century was the end of communism, and fascism, they lost. We won. Democracy won. But look at us, he says. A divided nation. And we all know, he says, and I think he's right, things are not good. Things are bad. And he speaks about what we've done to make it so. And he talks about the atomized atomic, I guess I'm having trouble with the word, atomized individual, the single individual, cut loose from the things that gave us identity and gave us love and support and made us human. We've cut loose from that. The church, the family, the community, what we have in this country of ours are all of these individuals who are living what he calls a ruthless meritocracy. What he means by that is it's every person for themselves. You're only as good as you can compete and earn and make and be better than other people. Brooks says what that's done is just to divide us. The single, solitary individual. And we can't make it like that. We're connected. We need each other. We can't love God without each other. We can't love neighbor without each other. Community and church and family and all that brings us together as a people is what makes us human. I love that 11th chapter of the book of Hebrews. It's a wonderful chapter. I go back to it so often to read it. What the writer of Hebrews does in that 11th chapter is to give the roll call of the faithful. Oh, it's just amazing. He goes back to Abel, and then he talks about Abraham and David and Samson and all of these great people that have gone before us. And then he goes into the list of the unnamed people. He says they were tortured, they were imprisoned, they were sawn into, they lived with animal skins, they lived in holes in the ground, and he says of them, of whom the world is not worthy. The world is not worthy. There's the greatness of all of these faithful people of God, this roll call. And then he says at the end of the chapter that they will not be made perfect apart from us. You get it? We will all be made perfect. That's the gift that God brings. We will be forgiven and healed, transformed, presented to God perfect. But the writer of Hebrews says, but not by ourselves. Even the greatest of the greatest among us cannot be brought to perfection without all of us. We are connected together. And life happens because community and fellowship and body of Christ and the fact that we love each other and care for each other. And what happens to one happens to all. So we are all concerned because we are all one. We are all connected together. And so at the wedding, when there was no wine, Jesus did a sign. The Bible doesn't talk about a miracle. It talks about a sign. There are 6 stone jars, empty. Jesus says to the servants, fill them up. They're filled with water. Jesus says to the steward, now take out a cup. And he took it out and tasted it. Whoa. The best wine. Never tasted wine better than this wine. And the party went on. It's a sign, an epiphany. In this season of Epiphany, we're looking for such a sign. The sign is Jesus himself, the best wine. Oh, friend, you will never find a gift, a blessing, greater and richer than this gift. This is the gift of gifts. This is the best that we will ever have. Don't look anywhere else for anything better than Jesus Christ, the Lord, the Son of God, the King of Israel. This is God's greatest gift. And 120 gallons? Why, that's way too much. I mean, even this little village here is not going to be able to drink in a week's time 120 gallons of wine. It's more than enough. It's an abundance. An abundance. Which is a sign for us in Epiphany season. God's gifts don't come trickling. We don't have to squeeze them. We don't have to beg for them. We don't have to wonder, are God's gifts going to run dry? Tomorrow, am I going to be bereft? Am I going to be left on my own? It's an abundance, you see. 120 gallons. The abundance. That's the whole point of the story. It's more than we could ever use or ever need. So, we come to the story. Broken in some places. Struggling in some places. Hurting in some places. Incomplete in some places. And we come to be filled again with an overflowing rich wine, better and more than we could ever know. Do you get it? Do you see what's there? Not just for you, not just for me, but for all of us. Amen.